In the summer of 1891, a woman named Mrs. S.W. Culp was doing something she had done hundreds of times before. She was breaking apart a lump of coal to feed into her kitchen stove in Morrisonville, Illinois. The coal came from a mine in southern Illinois, the kind of unremarkable daily task that leaves no memory afterward. But on this particular morning, when the lump split open in her hands, something fell out from its center. A small gold chain, about 10 inches long, made of 8-karat gold, curled neatly inside a circular hollow that had been pressed into the coal itself. Both ends of the chain were still embedded in the two halves of the broken lump. The impression it left in the coal was so precise, so perfectly shaped around every link, that it was impossible to argue the chain had simply fallen in by accident. It had been inside, completely inside, and the coal surrounding it had been formed, according to geologists from the Illinois State Geological Survey, somewhere between 260 and 320 million years ago during the Carboniferous period, when dense prehistoric swamps covered the earth and the earliest dinosaurs were still tens of millions of years away from existing. The Morrisonville Times reported the discovery on June 11th of that same year, and the story spread. Investigators at the time agreed that the chain had not been dropped in recently. The coal itself bore witness to that. But nobody could explain how an 8-karat gold chain of clearly deliberate and crafted design had ended up sealed inside rock that predated not just human civilization, but the entire genus to which human beings belong. The story was filed away, argued over, dismissed by some, celebrated by others, and eventually forgotten by most. It should not have been forgotten. What Mrs. Culp found that morning belongs to a category of objects so uncomfortable for mainstream science that they were given a technical name to contain them at arm's length: out-of-place artifacts, OOPArts. The term was formally introduced by American naturalist Ivan Sanderson in the 1960s, though the objects themselves had been turning up for well over a century before anyone thought to label them. An OOPArt is any object discovered in a geological or archaeological context that should, by every accepted standard of science and history, be impossible. A man-made item found inside rock that formed millions of years before human hands existed. A piece of technology sealed in a layer of earth so ancient that no civilization should have been present to place it there. There are dozens of these objects on record. Some have been convincingly explained, others have not. A small number remain in a strange suspended state between proven hoax and unexplained phenomenon. And a handful are so specific, so precisely documented, and so structurally bizarre that they continue to resist any simple dismissal. This is about 5 of them. 5 objects that were found inside rock, coal, and ancient geological formations, where they had no right to be, and what they might or might not tell us about everything we think we know. The gold chain from Morrisonville is the beginning, but it is not the most unsettling. In 1852, nearly 4 decades before Mrs. Culp sat down at her stove, a crew of workers was blasting rock at Meeting House Hill in Dorchester, Massachusetts. They were breaking apart an ancient geological formation known as the Roxbury Conglomerate, a type of rock that geologists have since dated to the Ediacaran period, between 570 and 593 million years ago. That is not a small number. 593 million years ago, there was no life on land. There were no vertebrates. There were no insects. The most complex life forms on the planet were soft-bodied organisms drifting in shallow Precambrian seas. This was before fish, before plants on land, before almost everything. When the blast went off and the rock cracked apart, workers found 2 pieces of a metal object lying in the debris. When the pieces were fitted together, they formed a bell-shaped vessel, 4.5 inches high, 6.5 inches wide at the base, narrowing to 2.5 inches at the top. The metal was about 1/8 of an inch thick, and its color resembled zinc or some kind of composition alloy. Around its surface were 6 figures of a flower, each one inlaid with pure silver, and running around the base was a vine or wreath design also inlaid in silver. It was beautiful. It was deliberate. It was crafted with obvious skill and artistic intention. The story was reprinted in Scientific American on June 5, 1852, under the title "A Relic of a Bygone Age." The question immediately raised was the same one that has followed this object ever since. How does a decorative silver-inlaid metal vessel end up inside rock that is nearly 600 million years old? The object became known as the Dorchester Pot. Archaeological critics, writing centuries later, including Keith Fitzpatrick Matthews and James Dozer of the website Bad Archaeology, have identified the object as clearly matching Victorian-era craftsmanship, likely a candlestick holder of the period. They point out that the object was found loose among rubble after an explosion, not verified to have been sealed inside the rock itself. There were no witnesses to its exact position before the blast, no photographs were taken in situ, and Victorian craftsmen were making objects of exactly this style and decoration in that era. These are serious objections. They are the kind of objections that should be raised, but they do not fully close the question either. because the two pieces of the vessel fit together so precisely that the original report insisted they had clearly been a single object before fracturing, and the impression of the pieces in the surrounding rubble was described as consistent with having been embedded. The Dorchester Pot is today believed to be held at the Jenny J. Tingley Museum in Upton, Massachusetts, though it has never undergone modern non-destructive testing. No spectrometry has been conducted on it. No petrological analysis of the surrounding material has ever been published. The object sits in a museum. The mystery sits beside it. Now we go deeper, in every sense. In 1961, 3 gem hunters were searching the Coso Mountains of eastern California for geodes, the hollow rocks lined with mineral crystals that collectors prize and sell. Wallace Lane, Virginia Maxey, and Mike Mikesell were out on February 13th of that year and collected a haul of ordinary-looking rocks to bring back to their gift shop in Olancha, California. The next day, Mikesell began cutting the rocks open with a diamond saw. One of them resisted far more than the others. It was so hard that the diamond blade wore out, completely cutting through it. When it finally split, there was no hollow center filled with crystals. Instead, there was a cylindrical object made of white porcelain surrounded by rings of copper. At the center of the cylinder was a shaft of bright, magnetized metal. X-ray analysis revealed a magnetic rod inside the cylinder and a metal spring coiled around it. It looked exactly like a spark plug. And this is where the story becomes genuinely strange. The outer casing of the rock was encrusted with fossil shells, which Virginia Maxey claimed a geologist had dated to at least 500,000 years ago. The object was immediately labeled a 500,000-year-old spark plug, a piece of early 20th century engine technology sealed inside ancient geological material. Creationists celebrated it. Alternative history writers built entire chapters around it. And for years, the Coso Artifact, as it came to be known, circulated as one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that something was deeply wrong with the standard timeline. Then came the debunking, and it was thorough. Pierre Stromberg of the Pacific Northwest Skeptics investigated the case extensively. He reached out to the Spark Plug Collectors of America, and its president, Chad Wyndham, examined X-ray images of the object. Wyndham identified it as a champion spark plug from the 1920s. Paul Willis and Ronald Willis had already conducted an experiment years earlier, in which they cut a contemporary spark plug in half and found that all of its internal components matched the Coso artifact precisely. The porcelain sleeve, the central electrode, the copper ring, the spring. All of it was consistent with a mass-produced automobile spark plug from the early 20th century, not with an object of prehistoric origin. The more likely explanation is that the rock surrounding it was not a true geode at all, but a concretion, a mass of hardened mineral material that can form around an object over decades, not millions of years, given the right soil chemistry. A spark plug lost or discarded in the Coso Mountains sometime in the 1920s, left in mineral-rich ground, could plausibly have developed a hard outer casing of iron oxides and calcified shells within decades. That is not magic. That is basic geology. But even here, a small asterisk remains. The Coso artifact disappeared for a period after the initial investigation. When it resurfaced in later years, it had passed through multiple private hands. No petrological study was ever formally published about the specific mineral composition of the outer casing. No paleontological analysis was conducted on the shells to determine whether they genuinely dated to the Pleistocene or were simply modern marine organisms carried inland and calcified quickly. The skeptical case is by far the stronger one. The object is almost certainly a 1920s spark plug in a concretion. Almost certainly. Now we leave California and cross the ocean to Romania. In 1974, construction workers digging along the banks of the Mureș River near the town of Aiud in central Romania were excavating a sand trench 10 meters deep when they found 3 objects buried together. 2 of them were immediately recognizable. Large fossilized bones belonging to a mastodon, an extinct elephant-like mammal that died out at the end of the last ice age, somewhere between 10,000 and 80,000 years ago, depending on the regional population. The third object was something else entirely. It was a wedge-shaped piece of metal approximately 20 centimeters long, 12 centimeters wide, and 7 centimeters thick. It weighed around 2.3 kilograms. Its shape was precise and deliberate, with 2 cylindrical holes cut through it at specific angles and visible tool marks on its sides. It was lightweight in a way that suggested its material was unusual. When Romanian authorities analyzed it at the Archaeological Institute of Cluj-Napoca, under the direction of Dr. Niederkorn of the Institute for the Study of Metals and Non-Metallic Minerals, the results were startling. The object was made of an aluminum alloy consisting of 89% aluminum combined with 12 other elements, including copper, zinc, lead, tin, zirconium, cadmium, nickel, cobalt, bismuth, silver, and gold. The problem is aluminum. Commercial aluminum smelting was not invented until 1825, and the industrial process for producing aluminum from bauxite ore at scale was not perfected until the 1880s. Producing the kind of complex aluminum alloy found in the Aiud Wedge requires temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, and processing techniques that simply did not exist before the modern industrial era. And yet here was such an alloy, buried 10 meters underground alongside bones of a creature that died out thousands of years ago. The oxide layer coating the object, about 1 millimeter thick, was consistent with extreme age. Romanian officials, after examining the bones and the object together, estimated the artifact to be around 250,000 years old. That estimate was later supported by a laboratory in Lausanne, Switzerland, though the methodology behind that specific dating has never been fully published or subjected to independent peer review. The skeptical explanations are available and they deserve fair hearing. Local historian Mihai Wittenberger has suggested the wedge may be a metal component from a World War II German aircraft, specifically a foot of the landing gear from a Messerschmitt Me 262 or similar craft. Germany operated extensively in Romania during the Second World War, and aircraft wreckage did end up buried in riverbanks and fields across the region. A piece of aluminum alloy from a 1940s aircraft buried in sandy riverbed sediment could plausibly have become covered by enough material over 80 years to sit at significant depth. But the stratigraphic problem is harder to dismiss than it might seem. The wedge was found in the same layer as the mastodon bones, not above them, not in a clearly disturbed section. Sand trench sediment along a river can shift and settle over decades, but the lateral co-location of the mastodon fossils and the metal object in the same horizontal stratum has never been cleanly explained by the German aircraft theory. The object currently resides in the Museum of History of Transylvania in Cluj-Napoca. It has not been subjected to modern non-destructive testing using current spectrometry or scanning electron microscopy that might resolve the debate about its precise composition and the depth of its oxide layer. It sits on a shelf, labeled, catalogued, and fundamentally unresolved. The Wedge of Aiud is, among all 5 objects in this story, the one that most visibly resists a clean explanation. Not because the alternative history version of events is credible. It is not, but because the most plausible ordinary explanation also has problems that have not been fully addressed. That is a specific and honest kind of mystery, and it deserves to be named as such. And then there is the London hammer. In 1936, Max Hahn and his wife Emma were walking along a waterfall near the small town of London in Texas when they found a rock with a piece of wood sticking out of it. They took it home. It sat on a shelf for roughly a decade. In 1947, their son broke the rock open and found something unexpected. The wooden handle was connected to a metal head. It was a hammer, an iron-headed wooden-handled hammer sealed inside a nodule of Cretaceous sandstone, and the surrounding rock formation was initially estimated at anywhere between 100 million and 300 million years old. The iron head of the hammer measures about 6 inches in length. The wooden handle, partially petrified from long contact with mineral-rich surroundings, transitions at one end into what appears to be coal. Metallurgical analysis conducted later found the iron head to be approximately 96% iron with trace amounts of chlorine and sulfur. The high chlorine content was unusual, provoking immediate speculation. Chlorine at that concentration is not found in modern commercial iron alloys. Supporters of the ancient origin theory pointed to this as evidence of a now lost metallurgical process. Today, the London hammer is kept at the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas, founded by Carl Baugh, who uses the artifact as evidence for young Earth creationism, arguing that the geological timeline is fundamentally wrong. This context matters. The object has been in private possession since it was found, has never been subjected to fully independent scientific testing, and Baugh has historically declined to allow unrestricted access to researchers. A radiocarbon date on the wood has never been published through peer-reviewed channels. No independent geologist has been permitted to analyze the specific concretion surrounding the hammer and establish whether it formed around the hammer over a geologically brief period or was an original feature of the ancient rock. Because here is what geologists know with confidence. Concretions form. They form when mineral-laden water seeps through soil and precipitates solid material around any available nucleus, which can be a rock fragment, a bone, a shell, or a human-made object. Under the right conditions, a dense mineral concretion can form around a lost tool within decades or a few centuries, and from the outside, it becomes visually indistinguishable from the surrounding ancient rock. A hammer lost by a 19th century Texas miner or settler, dropped into a limestone crevice near a stream, could plausibly have developed a hard mineral shell within 1 or 2 generations, and been discovered by the Hans, looking exactly as it did in 1936. This is the most straightforward explanation. It is consistent with known geology. It explains the chlorine, which could have entered the iron from mineral-rich groundwater over a century or two. It explains the petrified handle, which would naturally absorb silica from surrounding material during extended soil contact. It explains everything except one thing. It has never been formally tested. The skeptical case is almost certainly correct, and yet it remains, at a technical level, an assumption about an artifact nobody has been allowed to properly study. The scientific community cannot officially disprove the London hammer because it has not been given the opportunity to test it. Glenn J. Kubin, a researcher who has studied the hammer in detail, has noted that even the limestone surrounding the hammer could contain materials formed in Cretaceous times without that implying the hammer was sealed inside during that era. Ancient rock dissolves and reprecipitates constantly in the presence of groundwater. What looks like a hammer sealed in 300-million-year-old stone might be a hammer sitting at the center of a mineral nodule that grew around it in the last 2 centuries, embedded in a broader formation of genuinely ancient origin. The London hammer will remain unresolved for as long as it remains in private hands and unavailable for independent study. That is not a mystery produced by the object. It is a mystery produced by the ownership arrangements surrounding it. So what do we actually have when we look at all 5 of these objects together? A gold chain in coal, a decorated metal vessel in half-billion-year-old rock, a spark plug in a concretion, an aluminum wedge beside mastodon bones, a hammer in sandstone. Each one occupies a slightly different position on the spectrum between explained and unexplained. The Coso Artifact is almost certainly a 1920s spark plug in a rapidly formed concretion. The evidence for that conclusion is substantial, and the object itself matches a known mass-produced product of the early 20th century in every identifiable detail. The Dorchester Pot is most likely a Victorian decorative object that ended up in the debris of a rock blast without having been sealed inside the ancient formation. The London hammer is almost certainly a 19th century tool around which a mineral concretion formed within a geologically brief time frame. The Morrisonville gold chain remains genuinely unclear, the record of its discovery is thin, and the most damaging detail noted by researchers at Bad Archaeology is the fact that Mrs. Culp's husband was simultaneously the proprietor of both the local newspaper that published the account and a jewelry shop in the same town. That is a coincidence worth noting. The Wedge of Aiud is the most structurally puzzling of the 5. Because the German aircraft explanation, while plausible, has documented problems with the sedimentary context that have not been adequately addressed. None of these 5 objects are likely to be what the most dramatic interpretations suggest. None of them are credible evidence of a prehistoric industrial civilization or extraterrestrial technology. The cumulative case for a vanished ancient advanced society made from OOPArts is weak, because the objects themselves, even if genuine, form a wildly inconsistent collection with no coherent pattern of technology, geography, or timeline. But there is a more interesting scientific question buried under all of this, and it was raised in a 2018 academic paper by astrophysicist Gavin Schmidt and astrobiologist Adam Frank. Their paper, which they titled the Silurian Hypothesis, after a fictional species from the television program Doctor Who, posed a methodological question rather than a claim. If an industrial civilization had existed on Earth millions of years before humanity, what physical traces would remain in the geological record today? The answer they arrived at was sobering. Relatively few. Concrete structures dissolve over geological time. Metals oxidize and disperse into surrounding rock. Plastics, which we imagine as permanent, break down over centuries. The most detectable signature of an industrial civilization, if enough time passes, would not be hammers or pots. It would be subtle chemical anomalies in sedimentary layers, unusual isotope ratios, a spike in carbon dioxide preserved in ice cores, a chemical marker of large-scale combustion at a geologically specific moment. Schmidt and Frank were not claiming such a civilization existed. They were asking whether our geological methods were even designed to find one if it had. And the answer, as they framed it, is not really. We search for fossils and minerals, not for the industrial signatures of vanished intelligence. This does not rescue the London hammer or the Dorchester Pot. They are almost certainly what they appear to be at the mundane level. What it does is raise a quieter and more legitimate question. Are we looking for the right things? Are the methods by which we reconstruct the deep past actually capable of detecting everything the past might have contained? We live on a planet that is 4.5 billion years old. Our civilization is, at most, a few thousand years old. Modern industrial civilization is less than 300 years old. In geological terms, all of human history is not even a visible line. A tool dropped in 1922 has already, in some documented cases, formed a hard mineral casing indistinguishable from ancient rock. A fire lit and extinguished 10 million years ago would leave only a faint chemical smear in a sediment layer that most geologists would not know to look for. The objects in this story are not windows into a lost civilization. They are almost all mistakes of context, misidentifications of formation processes, products of the gap between what we see and what we understand about how geology actually works. but they are also, in their small and frequently misleading way, reminders that the boundary between the possible and impossible is drawn by current knowledge, and current knowledge is always incomplete. Mrs. Culp sat at her stove in 1891 and broke open a piece of coal and a gold chain fell out. What she had actually found, we will never know for certain. The coal is gone. The chain has not been located in any documented collection. The newspaper that reported the discovery was owned by her husband, who sold jewelry. Everything that could have settled the question has long since disappeared. That is not a grand mystery. It is a small one. But it is exactly the kind of small mystery that tends to accumulate when you spend enough time looking at what comes out of the ground and wondering whether the ground has been holding everything it knows.